Imagine being captured, chained, forced onto a ship. You survive weeks crossing the Atlantic Ocean. You arrive in the Caribbean, weak, terrified, traumatized, and then someone heats an iron and presses it into your chest, burning your skin, branding you like cattle. The letters say D.Y., Duke of York. Between 1672 and 1731, the Royal African Company transported over 187,000 African people to the Americas. Many were branded with those letters, D.Y., because the company was owned and run by James, Duke of York, brother to King Charles II. James Stuart was born on October 14, 1633, at St. James's Palace. He was the second son of King Charles I and Queen Henrietta Maria. His older brother, also named Charles, would be heir to the throne. James was second in line, the spare heir. He grew up in luxury, privilege, and crisis. When James was 6 years old, the English Civil War broke out. The parliamentarians, led by Oliver Cromwell, fought against the royalists who supported the king. James's childhood was shaped by war, political upheaval, and eventually the execution of his father. In 1649, when James was 15, his father, King Charles I, was beheaded. The monarchy was abolished. England became a commonwealth under Cromwell. James and his brother Charles fled to Europe as exiles. They spent the next 11 years in France and the Netherlands, moving between royal courts, living off the charity of other European monarchs, plotting to regain the throne. During this time, James served in the French and Spanish armies, gaining military experience. He developed interests in naval affairs and military strategy, and he developed the connections and ambitions that would shape what came next. In 1660, everything changed. Cromwell had died in 1658. The Commonwealth was collapsing. The English Parliament invited Charles to return as king. The monarchy was restored. Charles II became king, and James became Duke of York, and second in line to the throne again. Charles and James immediately began rewarding their supporters and building their power base. And one of their first moves was to exploit English trade with Africa. During the 1650s, while the Stuarts were in exile, the Dutch had dominated trade with West Africa. They had forts, trading posts, connections with African merchants and kingdoms. They traded for gold, ivory, and increasingly, enslaved people. The profits were enormous. Two men close to Charles and James understood this opportunity. Prince Rupert of the Rhine, Charles's cousin, had traveled to West Africa during the interregnum. He'd heard about gold deposits and seen the trading operations. Sir Robert Holmes was an Anglo-Irish mercenary and naval officer who'd served the royalist cause. Rupert and Holmes convinced James, Duke of York, that England needed to challenge Dutch dominance in West Africa. The profits from gold, ivory, and the growing slave trade were too large to ignore, and England had the naval power to take control if they acted decisively. In 1660, the same year Charles II was restored to the throne, a new company was chartered, the Company of Royal Adventurers Trading to Africa. Its principal sponsors were Prince Rupert and James, Duke of York, who became the company's governor. The company's original stated purpose was to exploit gold fields along the Gambia River, but from the beginning, it was also involved in trading enslaved people. The demand in English colonies, especially Barbados and Jamaica, was growing rapidly as sugar plantation production expanded. Plantation owners needed workers, and they were willing to pay high prices for enslaved Africans. In 1663, a fresh charter was issued that explicitly included the trade in enslaved people. The document stated the company could trade in gold, silver, Negroes, slaves, hides, wax, guinea grains, or other commodities of those countries. It was official, legal, protected by royal charter. The company was given a monopoly. No other English merchants could trade with West Africa without the company's permission. This monopoly was enforced by the Royal Navy. Any English ship found trading in violation of the monopoly could be seized. The proceeds from these seizures were split, half to the king, half to the company. James held two crucial positions. As Duke of York, he was governor of the Royal African Company. As Lord High Admiral, he controlled the Royal Navy, so he both ran the company and commanded the military force that protected its monopoly. He had complete control over England's involvement in the West African trade, but the company faced problems early on. War with the Netherlands in 1667 devastated the company's operations. The Dutch captured most of the company's forts on the African coast. The company fell into debt. It struggled to maintain operations. So in 1672, the company was reorganized and rechartered with a broader scope. This new version was called the Royal African Company, or RAC. James remained governor. The new charter gave the company even more explicit rights to set up forts and factories, maintain troops, and exercise martial law in West Africa in pursuit of trade. The new Royal African Company was more successful than the old one. It established 6 major forts on the Gold Coast, the region that's now Ghana. These weren't just trading posts. They were fortified military installations, high walls, cannon emplacements, barracks for soldiers, dungeons for holding enslaved people. Everything needed to control a section of coastline and defend against European rivals. Cape Coast Castle became the company's headquarters in West Africa. It was expanded and strengthened under James's governorship. The castle had everything: offices for company agents, living quarters for European staff, storerooms for trade goods, and extensive dungeons that could hold hundreds of enslaved people at once. The company also set up a major trading post at Ouidah, on what was called the Slave Coast, the region that's now Benin. This became the RAC's principal center for acquiring enslaved people. The Slave Coast was so named because it was the primary source region for the Atlantic slave trade. Dozens of European traders operated there, competing for access to the steady supply of people being brought from the interior. The system worked like this. English ships would sail from London, Bristol, or other ports, loaded with manufactured goods. The cargo wasn't random. It was specifically chosen based on what African merchants and rulers wanted: textiles, colorful cloth, fine fabrics, metal goods, tools, knives, copper and brass items, guns, muskets and pistols that African kingdoms used in their own conflicts, gunpowder, alcohol, especially rum and brandy, glass beads, luxury items. These goods represented significant value in England, but they could be produced relatively cheaply through England's growing manufacturing sector. The profit margin came from trading goods that were inexpensive to produce for people who could be sold at high prices in the Americas. The ships would sail to the West African coast, a voyage that typically took 6 to 8 weeks from England. They'd dock at one of the company's forts: Cape Coast Castle, Elmina, after the English took it from the Dutch, Ouidah, James Fort on the Gambia River. Each fort controlled a section of coastline and had relationships with inland African merchants. Company agents at the forts would negotiate with African traders. These negotiations could take weeks or months. African merchants would arrive with people they'd acquired through warfare, raiding, or other means. The company agents would inspect the people, checking their health, age, strength. Then they'd negotiate prices. The pricing was complex. Different types of trade goods had different values. A young, healthy man might cost the equivalent of several muskets, some cloth, and some alcohol. A woman might cost less unless she was young and considered suitable for certain types of work. Children cost less than adults. The sick or weak were rejected entirely. The company only wanted people who could survive the Middle Passage and be sold profitably. African merchants drove hard bargains. They understood the value of what they had. They played European traders against each other. The English against the Dutch, against the Portuguese, against the French. Competition among European nations for access to enslaved people gave African merchants leverage. They could demand better goods, better prices, better terms. But the European demand was so strong that the supply kept flowing. As long as ships kept coming offering manufactured goods, African merchants and kingdoms could profit by providing people. The system fed itself. More demand led to more supply, more warfare, more raiding. More people captured specifically to sell to Europeans. Once purchased, people were held in the company's forts, essentially dungeons where they'd wait for ships. These dungeons were terrible. Dark, crowded, unsanitary. People were chained to prevent escape, fed minimal rations, just enough to keep them alive. Many got sick. Some died before ships even arrived. The company saw this as an acceptable cost of business. They'd calculated the expected losses at each stage. Cape Coast Castle's dungeons could hold over 1,000 people at once. The conditions were deliberately harsh, crushing people's spirits, breaking resistance, making them easier to control during the voyage. People might spend weeks or even months in these dungeons, depending on how long it took to fill a ship. Then came loading the ships. This was a controlled, systematic process. People would be brought from the dungeons, often in groups, checked one final time, then led through what's now called the Door of No Return, the passage from the fort to the waiting ships. It was given that name because people who went through that door almost never returned to Africa. The Middle Passage, the voyage across the Atlantic, was the RAC's core business. The company owned multiple ships designed specifically for this trade. The ships weren't built for comfort or speed. They were built to maximize capacity. Platforms were installed in the holds to allow people to be packed on multiple levels. Ventilation was minimal. The design prioritized fitting as many people as possible. People were chained together, men usually in pairs or groups, locked at the wrists or ankles. They'd be packed into the holds lying down, with barely room to sit up. The ceilings were low. The air was stifling. In tropical heat, the temperature below deck would become unbearable. The voyage took 6 to 8 weeks depending on weather and currents. During this time, people were kept below deck most of the time. They'd be brought up occasionally for fresh air and forced exercise. The captains knew that people who couldn't move at all would be too weak to sell. But mostly, they stayed chained in the holds. Food and water were rationed carefully. Ships carried provisions, but not generously. The goal was to keep people alive for the voyage, not to keep them healthy or comfortable. The diet was minimal, often just some rice or cornmeal, some water, occasionally some salt fish or meat. Barely enough calories to survive. Sanitation was essentially non-existent. People had to relieve themselves where they lay. The smell was overwhelming. Disease spread rapidly in these conditions. Dysentery, smallpox, fever. Once someone got sick, the disease would sweep through the crowded holds. Many died. Their bodies would be thrown overboard. The death rate averaged 15 to 20% on Middle Passage voyages, but it varied widely. Some voyages lost half their human cargo, others lost less. The RAC tracked these numbers carefully. They were business metrics. They calculated expected deaths into their pricing. They knew that out of 500 people loaded in Africa, maybe 400 to 425 would arrive alive in the Caribbean. They priced accordingly to maintain profitability. For the people enduring this, it was hell. Torn from home, chained in darkness, watching people around them die, not knowing where they were going or what would happen. Many spoke different languages. The company mixed people from different regions to make communication and resistance harder. People couldn't console each other, couldn't organize, couldn't even ask basic questions. Just endure until the voyage ended. Those who survived arrived in Barbados, Jamaica, Virginia, or other English colonies. The ships would dock, and people would be brought on deck, weak, sick, traumatized from weeks in the holds. And this is where the branding happened. Before people could be sold, they had to be marked. The company's property had to be identified. Hot irons were prepared, metal shaped into letters, heated until glowing, then pressed into skin, into chest or shoulder or back, burning through skin layers, creating permanent scars in the shape of letters. D.Y. Duke of York, James's personal initials, his mark of ownership, or RAC, Royal African Company, the institution's mark, or sometimes RACE, Royal African Company of England, the full branding. Think about what that means. Not just the physical pain of being branded like livestock, though that pain was real and intense. Hot iron burning through skin, creating a wound that would take weeks to heal, leaving a permanent scar. But the psychological message was even more brutal. You are property. You are owned. You bear the mark of your owner on your body forever. It was dehumanization made literal and permanent. You couldn't forget what had been done to you because the evidence was burned into your flesh. Every time you looked down, every time you touched that spot, you'd feel the raised scar tissue in the shape of letters. DY or RACA permanent reminder, and everyone who saw you would know you'd been branded. Other enslaved people, plantation owners, overseers. It marked you as having come through the Royal African Company's system. It marked you as James's property, or the company's property. Ownership literally inscribed on the body. After branding, people were sold, sometimes at public auctions, standing on blocks while potential buyers inspected them, checking teeth, muscles, looking for signs of disease or weakness. Families would be separated, children sold away from parents, siblings split up, husbands from wives. The company and the buyers didn't care about keeping families together. They cared about profits. Sometimes sales were private, plantation owners coming to the docks to buy people directly from the company agents. Large plantations might buy dozens of people at once. Smaller operations might buy just one or two. Either way, the RAC made enormous profits. People who'd been purchased in Africa for the equivalent of manufactured goods worth perhaps £3 or £4 could be sold in Barbados or Jamaica for £20, £25, even £30 or more. Young, healthy men commanded the highest prices, women less, unless they were young and considered suitable for bearing children. Skilled workers, people who could do carpentry or work with animals or had other abilities, might fetch premium prices. The profit margins were massive. A ship that had cost perhaps £2,000 to outfit and operate could generate £10,000 or more in sales from its human cargo. After paying crew, paying the Ford agents, covering losses, the company still made enormous profits. 50% returns, 75% returns, sometimes double or triple the investment. In the 1680s, when the RAC was at its peak under James's governance, the company was transporting about 5,000 enslaved people per year. 5,000 people annually, branded, sold, condemned to plantation labor. And this went on year after year, decade after decade. The profits flowed back to London. The company paid dividends to shareholders, wealthy merchants, nobles, investors. James, as governor and largest shareholder, received the lion's share. The crown received its portion. The money circulated through the English economy, funding other ventures, building wealth that would compound over generations. Ordinary English people benefited too. Shipbuilders constructed the RAC's vessels. Rope makers, sail makers, blacksmiths, all supplied the ships. Merchants provided the trade goods. Workers in various industries had jobs connected to the RAC's operations. The wealth created by the slave trade spread through English society at all levels, and it was all legal, protected by royal charter, enforced by the Royal Navy that James controlled as Lord High Admiral. Celebrated as successful commerce, James wasn't hiding his involvement. He was governor of the company. His name was on the official documents. His initials were literally branded on people's bodies. Everyone knew. It was official policy, backed by the full power of the English state. In 1685, James's brother Charles II died unexpectedly. James succeeded him, becoming King James II of England and Ireland, and James VII of Scotland. A slave trader became king. The man whose initials had been branded on thousands of people was now the monarch of 3 kingdoms. This wasn't some secret from his past coming to light. James's role in the Royal African Company was public knowledge. He'd been governor for 25 years by this point. Everyone in government, everyone in business circles, everyone who paid attention to English commerce knew that the new king had made his fortune from the slave trade. And nothing changed. James remained chief stockholder in the Royal African Company. He continued to profit from its operations. The company continued transporting thousands of people per year from Africa to the Americas. Being king didn't separate him from the business. If anything, it gave the company even more protection and legitimacy. The royal seal of approval was more explicit than ever. The company operated under royal charter. The king himself was its largest shareholder. The message to other English merchants was clear. The slave trade was not just acceptable, it was royally sanctioned at the highest level. But James's reign as king was troubled from the start. He was Catholic in a Protestant nation. England had gone through decades of religious conflict, and the religious settlement had established the Church of England as Protestant. Most of the population was Protestant. Parliament was Protestant. The power structure was Protestant. James tried to increase Catholic rights. He appointed Catholics to government positions, including in the military. He issued declarations of religious tolerance that benefited Catholics. He tried to pack Parliament with Catholic supporters. These moves alarmed Protestant England deeply. There was fear that James was trying to re-establish Catholicism as the state religion. Fear that he'd align England with Catholic France against Protestant nations. Fear that the gains of the Protestant Reformation would be reversed. This wasn't just about religious preference. It was about power, politics, foreign policy, and English identity. The crisis came to a head in 1688. James's second wife, Mary of Modena, gave birth to a son, James Francis Edward Stuart. This meant a Catholic heir. Before this, James's daughters from his first marriage, Mary and Anne, both Protestant, were next in line. Now there was a Catholic son who would inherit the throne and potentially establish a Catholic dynasty. Protestant leaders in England couldn't accept this. They began plotting. They reached out to James's daughter Mary and her husband William of Orange, who ruled the Netherlands. Both were Protestant. They invited William to invade England with Dutch troops and take the throne. In November 1688, William landed in England with a Dutch army. James's support collapsed quickly. Much of the English army defected to William. James's younger daughter Anne joined William's side. Even some of James's Catholic supporters abandoned him. James fled London, was captured, then allowed to escape to France. He lived the rest of his life in exile at the French court. William and Mary were declared joint monarchs in 1689. This became known as the Glorious Revolution. Glorious because it was relatively bloodless compared to other regime changes, and because it established certain constitutional principles limiting royal power. And this political change had major consequences for the Royal African Company. With James deposed and in exile, the company lost its royal patron and chief stockholder. More importantly, it lost political protection. Merchants from other English cities, especially Bristol and Liverpool, had been chafing under the RAC's monopoly for years. They'd seen the enormous profits the company made. They wanted access to the West African trade, but the RAC's royal charter gave it exclusive rights, enforced by the Navy. With James gone, these merchants saw an opportunity. They lobbied Parliament hard. They argued that the monopoly was unfair, that it restricted English commerce, that more merchants participating would increase England's share of the trade. They had support from colonial planters in the Caribbean who wanted more enslaved people at lower prices. The monopoly kept prices high. Parliament, now with increased power relative to the monarchy after the Glorious Revolution, listened. In 1698, Parliament passed the Trade with Africa Act. This officially ended the RAC's monopoly. The act said that any English merchant could trade with West Africa as long as they paid a 10% levy to the RAC on goods exported from Africa. The levy was supposed to help maintain the forts, but it meant the monopoly was broken. This actually increased English involvement in the slave trade dramatically. Before 1698, only the RAC could legally trade with West Africa. The company transported about 5,000 people per year. After 1698, any English merchant with a ship and capital could participate. Bristol merchants jumped in. Liverpool merchants jumped in. Smaller port cities got involved. The number of enslaved people transported on English ships increased massively after the monopoly ended. What had been one company transporting 5,000 per year became dozens of traders transporting tens of thousands per year. By the early 1700s, England was transporting more enslaved people than any other European nation. The RAC continued operating, but faced increased competition. It kept trading in enslaved people until 1731, when it switched focus to ivory and gold. In 1752, Parliament dissolved the company and transferred its assets to a new organization. But by then, the damage was done. Between 1672 and 1731, the RAC's active period in the slave trade, The company transported over 187,000 African people to the Americas. Historian William Pettigrew has stated that the Royal African Company shipped more enslaved African women, men, and children to the Americas than any other single institution during the entire period of the transatlantic slave trade. Let that sink in. More than any other single institution, not just English institutions, any institution from any country during the entire history of the transatlantic slave trade. The Royal African Company, governed by James, Duke of York, later King James II, holds that infamous record. And those 187,000 people were just the beginning. The RAC's operations established the infrastructure, the trading relationships, the forts, the routes, the business model. After the monopoly ended in 1698, other English traders used that infrastructure. They expanded on what the RAC had built. Between 1690 and 1807, an estimated 6 million enslaved Africans were transported from West Africa to the Americas on British or Anglo-American ships. 6 million people. And it all built on the foundation that James and the RAC had established. The profits from this trade funded the British Treasury. They funded industries, buildings, railways, roads. The wealth from the slave trade helped make Britain the dominant global power of the 18th and 19th centuries. And the British monarchy profited directly from this trade, not just during James's time, but for generations afterward. James, Duke of York, later King James II, died in exile in France in 1701. He'd lost the throne in 1688, lived the last 13 years of his life as an exiled former king at the court of Louis XIV. He died at the Château de Saint-Germain-en-Laye, outside Paris, at age 67. He'd spent most of his adult life involved in the slave trade, from 1660, when he became governor of the First Company, through 1688, when he fled England. 28 years as the governor and chief beneficiary of the slave trade. He never expressed regret about the Royal African Company or the slave trade. In his writings, letters, and memoirs from exile, he treated it as normal commerce, just business, just trade, one of the many enterprises he'd been involved with during his active years. The branding, the deaths during the Middle Passage, the brutality of plantation slavery. None of it seems to have troubled his conscience or even merited much reflection. He died wealthy, having profited enormously from the RAC during his decades as governor and stockholder. His personal fortune was substantial, even in exile. And much of that wealth came directly from the slave trade. Every dividend the company paid, every share of profits he received, represented human beings transported, branded, sold, enslaved. The Royal African Company, the institution he governed for 28 years, transported over 187,000 people from Africa to the Americas during its active period in the slave trade, 1672 to 1731. More than any other single institution in the entire history of the transatlantic slave trade, each one branded, many with his own initials, DY, marking them as his property, his company's property. Those brands were permanent, scars that lasted a lifetime, physical reminders carved into skin that you were owned, you were property. You bore the mark of the Royal African Company and its governor. The pain of the branding itself faded after weeks or months, but the scar remained forever, raised tissue in the shape of letters, DY or RAC or RACE. Imagine carrying that mark for your entire life, working in sugarcane fields under the Caribbean sun, and every day seeing those letters on your own body, bathing and touching the scar tissue. getting dressed and feeling the fabric against the brand, having children and explaining to them what those letters mean, that your mother or father had been branded like an animal by the company that owned them, the psychological weight of that permanent marking, and knowing that the man whose initials you carried had been a prince, then a duke, then a king, that the power structure of England itself had branded you. That wasn't just one slave trader's mark. That was the mark of royal power, royal commerce, royal authority. It connected you directly to the highest levels of English society, but as property, not as a person. The Royal African Company continued operating after James's death and after the monopoly ended in 1698. It faced increased competition, but remained active. The company kept trading in enslaved people until 1731, 30 years after James's death, when it finally switched focus to ivory and gold. In 1752, Parliament formally dissolved the RAC and transferred all of its assets to a new organization called the Company of Merchants Trading to Africa. By then, the damage was done. The infrastructure was established. The forts James's company had built still stood on the African coast. The trading relationships were in place. The routes were proven. The business model was refined. Other British traders had expanded on everything the RAC had created. Britain transported millions of African people to the Americas over the next century after James's death, all building on the foundation that he and the RAC had laid. The forts they'd built became staging points for other traders. The relationships with African merchants continued. The door of no return at Cape Coast Castle saw hundreds of thousands more people pass through it long after the RAC was gone. Between 1690 and 1807, when Parliament finally abolished the British slave trade, an estimated 6 million enslaved Africans were transported from West Africa to the Americas on British or Anglo-American ships. 6 million people. And the system that transported them was built on the foundation James and the RAC had established in the 1660s to 1680s. Today, those former RAC forts in Ghana are UNESCO World Heritage Sites, Cape Coast Castle, Elmina Castle, others along the Gold Coast. They're museums now, preserving the history of the slave trade. The Ghanaian government and cultural organizations maintain them as education centers, places where people can confront this difficult history honestly. Visitors can walk through the dungeons where thousands of people were held. The rooms are small, dark, oppressive even now when they're empty and cleaned. Imagine them packed with hundreds of people. The stench, the heat, the fear, the despair. Visitors can see the door of no return, the narrow passage from the dungeon to the beach where ships waited. People passed through that door and onto ships that would carry them away from Africa forever. The door got its name because return was almost impossible. Once you passed through, you were gone. The museums display the history honestly. Information about the Royal African Company, James's role as governor, the branding practices, the number of people transported, the conditions of the Middle Passage, the destinations in the Caribbean and Americas, all documented, all explained, all preserved for education. In Britain, the monarchy's connection to the slave trade has become a topic of increasing discussion, particularly in recent years. For a long time after abolition in 1807, this history was downplayed or ignored in favor of celebrating Britain's role in ending the trade. The narrative became, Britain eventually did the right thing by abolishing the slave trade and then slavery itself. But that narrative ignored the centuries of involvement before abolition. It ignored the royal family's direct participation through companies like the RAC. It ignored the enormous wealth Britain accumulated through the slave trade, wealth that funded the Industrial Revolution and Britain's rise to global dominance. Historians have now documented the royal family's involvement extensively. It wasn't just James. Queen Elizabeth I approved and partially funded John Hawkins's slave trading voyages in the 1560s. Charles II chartered the RAC and profited from it. James II governed it and branded people with his initials. Later, monarchs continued to benefit from the slave trade through taxes, customs duties, and the general prosperity it brought to Britain. The profits from slavery funded the British Treasury. They funded the construction of buildings, roads, ports, infrastructure. They funded the Royal Navy that protected British shipping. They helped finance wars. They supported British industries. The Bank of England, founded in 1694, was partly financed by slave trade profits. Many of its early directors and major shareholders were involved in the trade. It's difficult, probably impossible, to calculate exactly how much of the current royal family's wealth derives ultimately from the slave trade. But historians agree that the slave trade was central to British wealth accumulation in the 17th, 18th, and early 19th centuries. And the monarchy benefited from that accumulation directly through their investments and indirectly through the prosperity of the realm they governed. The branding, those DY marks burned into thousands of people's skin, is perhaps the most visceral symbol of this involvement. It wasn't abstract. It wasn't indirect. It wasn't just general benefit from a system. It was literal. James's personal initials physically marked onto enslaved people's bodies, a permanent, painful reminder of ownership, power, and the dehumanization at the heart of slavery. Understanding James's role in the slave trade matters because it shows how deeply the institution was embedded in British society at the absolute highest levels. This wasn't criminals or pirates or marginal figures. This was the royal family itself, the government, the official commerce of the realm, operating openly, operating legally, operating profitably, protected by law, defended by the military, celebrated as successful enterprise. The system made it possible. The legal system protected it. The political system supported it. The economic system rewarded it. And James, Duke of York, later King James II, was at the center of that system for nearly 3 decades as governor of the institution that transported more enslaved people than any other. Over 187,000 people transported by the company he governed, thousands branded with his initials. Hundreds of thousands more transported by other British traders using the infrastructure and business model his company had established. Millions more over the following century, all building on that foundation. That's his legacy. Not just his failed 3-year kingship, not just his religious conflicts that led to his deposition, but his role in the slave trade, his 28-year governance of the largest slave trading institution in history, the DY brands that scarred thousands of bodies, the wealth he accumulated from human suffering, the system he helped establish and expand that would continue for another century after his death. The British monarchy has never formally apologized for its role in the slave trade. There have been statements expressing regret, acknowledgments that the slave trade was wrong, recognition of the suffering it caused, but no formal apology, no reparations, no concrete action to address the lasting wealth disparities created by centuries of enslaving people and exploiting their labor. This remains a deeply contentious issue, especially as more people understand the extent of royal involvement and as the wealth gap between Britain and former colonies remains stark. The wealth built on slavery didn't disappear. It was inherited, invested, reinvested, compounding over generations. Meanwhile, the descendants of enslaved people started with nothing after emancipation and faced continued discrimination and barriers. James, Duke of York, 1633 to 1701. King James II, from 1685 to 1688. Governor of the Royal African Company from 1660 to 1669, 1688. The man whose initials were branded on thousands of enslaved people. The king who built his fortune on the largest slave trading institution in history. The royal who literally marked his ownership on human beings' bodies. That's the story that needs to be told and remembered. Not to assign blame to people living today for what their ancestors did. Not to make modern British people feel guilty for history, but to understand how wealth and power were built, how systems of oppression functioned at the highest levels, how injustice was normalized, legalized, celebrated, and made royal. The brands have faded from history. The people who bore them died generations ago. But the legacy remains, in wealth disparities between nations, in institutions built with slave trade profits, in the historical record of what James did, what it meant, and how it shaped the world that came after. That's what we remember. That's what we learn from. That's what we can't afford to forget, minimize, or hide behind comfortable narratives about Britain eventually doing the right thing. James, Duke of York, the king who branded people with his initials, the royal slave trader who governed the company that transported more people than any other in the entire history of the transatlantic slave trade. That's his legacy. That's what history records. That's what we must not forget.